Welcome, students, to the lecture about the financial and political structures of education. If you're going to be teachers, it's important for you to understand how schools are funded, how that started, and how that controls some of the things that you're going to be experiencing in the classroom. So back in the 1950s, you might remember we went through a period where the American public was very dissatisfied with schools, primarily because Sputnik had happened, and we wanted to make sure that our kids were receiving an adequate, especially science and math education. So there started to be this rise of the anti-school movement that said that our schools weren't doing a good job teaching our children. Look, the Russians had reached space before us; they'd reached the moon. We were striving to outstrip the Russians and get to the moon first. There was a famous report called the Coleman Report that was produced in the 1960s that said, well, it really doesn't matter what schools do because achievement is really more related to family income and things outside of schools. Consequently, many people began to believe that schools did not even matter. And so there began to be this push to defund or take away funding from the schools. However, more recent analysis of the data that was used by the Coleman Report indicates some flaws in how they did the research that might suggest schooling does matter, particularly to poorer or disadvantaged groups. Home life and schools matter. So remember how we learned in our History of Education lecture that states and local communities had gained control of what was taught and implemented local policy. Remember, the federal government does not control what's taught. Those are the local school boards and local states and local communities. Well, this has huge implications today. If we turn to a pie chart that shows us where schools' money comes from, where does the funding come from, you can see by looking at the blue sector that 48% of school funding comes from the state, not the federal government. As a matter of fact, most of it comes from the state funding. 44% comes from local districts, mostly raised through property taxes, and only 8% funding comes from the federal government. This might be a surprise to you. You might have thought all schools were funded by the federal government, but that's not the case. It's mostly local funding. So, of these three pie sections, let's see where the money comes for each pie section. So that 8% federal part comes from citizen taxes that are allocated out to the Department of Education budget. So the current administration, the president, and the Congress pass a budget each year to determine how much money education will get. Not just education, but everything in the budget. The military, for example, gets a part of the pie, and education usually gets a much smaller part of the pie. But that's the 8%. The state funding is collected primarily through state taxes and fees. So when you go into a convenience store and you buy, for example, an ice cream and they charge you sales tax on that, part of that goes to fund education. It's allocated out through a similar process, but the governors and state legislators pass a budget saying how much funding education will get. Now, that large share for the district funding or local funding is collected primarily through property taxes. So what that means is when you buy a house and you have a mortgage, you pay a certain amount every month to pay down your mortgage, but you also pay property taxes that are collected and distributed to your local community. Some of this is allocated to local schools, and that's a big part of it. So you can see that how many property taxes are collected has a big impact on how well the schools are funded. Now, these funds are all distributed to the schools on what's called a per pupil expenditure, or PPE basis. And the PPE is at the individual amount per student that the school district gets to spend. It's enough to ensure there's enough to cover each child's education and enough to ensure funds for special programs like Students with Disabilities Special Education Funds. Each state has its own formula for these two amounts, and the formula varies widely from state to state. So some states might place more emphasis on providing funds for special education, for example. The amount of money particular schools receive tends to vary dramatically depending largely on property values, not just from state to state, but from district to district and from year to year. So this is important. If you live in a very affluent or wealthy community, you're probably able to pay more property taxes and your schools are going to be better funded. That's why when you drive through areas that are wealthier, you see better looking schools with more up-to-date textbooks, more computer labs, for example. When you drive through poorer areas, you see out-of-date textbooks, crumbling buildings, and it's because there are not enough property taxes to fund the schools. Some crises, for example, there was a recession that took place in 2007, resulted in reduced funding for schools and some stopgap measures. So you might have heard of the race to the top, which is an Obama era effort to fill the gap by actually introducing a competition to see which schools could improve their scores better. And then those schools received prizes or awards. So let's look at how per pupil expenditures vary. Vermont has the highest per pupil expenditures in the nation at $20,540, followed by us, New York, at $19,697. Now that might seem like a lot for a student, but when you think about how many things it has to cover all the building expenditures, including building buildings and maintaining buildings. It has to cover all the teachers' salaries. It has to cover all the administrators' salaries, both at the school level and the district level. And it has to include all types of staff and consulting. So it's quite a lot. But the other end of the scale, Utah spends the least at $7,635. This was of 2019. The national average stands at $12,756. So you can see if you live in a different state and you're a student, you're going to get a lot more or less spent on you depending on geography. So who controls what? Let's talk about the state first. So they get something for their money going in. The state levies taxes, as we talked about, for example, sales taxes. In return, they get to license teachers and other educators. So if you're trying to get certified, your certification will come from the state, not from the federal government. The state generally sets the standards for school attendance and safety. So, for example, in a normal year, not a COVID year, students had to attend 180 school days. They outline minimum curricular and graduation standards, and sometimes they even include specific textbooks to be used in competency tests. And they regulate the nature and size of local school districts. The state gets to set where the boundaries of the school district are, for example. Here is a current org chart for the state. You can see that everything is controlled by a board of regents. And then there is a commissioner of education who reports to that board of regents. There's several departments within the state. The senior deputy commissioner for education controls the pre-K to 12 curriculum and all the instructional support. Higher education is controlled by a different division, and you can look across and see the different divisions within the state. Now, what does the local district control? Well, they implement the state's regulations and policies. And so they control the local policies and practice for effective school administration. They're very involved with hiring local school personnel, providing funds to build and maintain appropriate facilities. They set salaries and working conditions, so your salary will not be set by the state, it'll be set by your school district. They understand the community best, so they translate those needs into educational practice. They initiate curriculum licensing or other requirements beyond state requirements. So often it will be the local school district that will adopt a textbook curriculum. And finally, they create current and long-range plans for the school district. So remember that federal government gives 8% of the school budget. So what did they get for that? Well, generally, they are more concerned with large-scale social justice reforms, such as desegregation of schools in the 1960s, Title I, Title IX issues for athletics for women, for example, IDEA for students with disability. So they want to come in and ensure that all students have the opportunity for equal education through legislative control. So I guess the question is, since we see lots of different amounts of money being spent on different school districts throughout the nation and on different per pupil expenditures, does money matter? So think back to the Coleman report in the 1960s, where a lot of people started arguing, well, it really doesn't matter how much we spend on schools. The question that we're trying to ask is, does more spending produce better student outcomes? Do students learn more when we give more money to the schools? In 1986, Hanishik used studies resulting from Coleman's data to ask this question and found that there appears to be no strong or systematic relationship between school expenditures and student performance. So what that was saying is, yeah, we kind of agree with what Coleman found. And this study has been mentioned time and time and time again by politicians who wish to starve education of funding. However, Hanishik did put a little footnote that said many of the studies Coleman reviewed have been discredited. Maybe we should take another look at this. So a decade later, 3 researchers by the name of Hedges, Greenwald, and Lane in 1996 gathered the same studies, but this time they established quality control measures for which studies they'd look at. They said, look, we're only going to look at U.S. data. The original data had looked at some international work. And we're only going to look at peer-reviewed studies. So that means we're only going to look at the studies where other people have said, yeah, this is a good study. And so they tossed out some poor studies, and when they reanalyzed the data, they found that per pupil expenditures did show strong and consistent relations with achievement. So what that means is the more people spend, or the more districts spend on their students, the higher student achievement went. In addition, resource variables that attempted to describe the quality of teachers showed very strong relations with student achievement. So what that means is kind of a common sense finding. The better your teachers, the more students achieved. So this leads to another question. Does how much paying teachers how much do teacher salaries affect student outcomes? That's a little more inconclusive. It appears to matter in some ways. Once we adjust for labor market factors, we estimate that raising teachers' wages by 10% reduces high school dropout rates by 3% to 4%. So the higher, if you can get your teacher salaries up to as much as 10%, high school dropout rates do fall. And they do appear to, better salaries do appear to attract better teachers and keep them in. We know there's a huge drop-off. Teachers tend to drop out of the profession around year 5, but they tend to stay in and get over that period if they are paid better. We also found that students in smaller classrooms do better academically. So this is a larger effect for minority and free lunch students. So you always hear people saying, well, class size doesn't really matter. Yes, actually it does, and especially for at-risk students. There was a famous project that took place some years ago, Project STAR, that found the main conclusions were that on average, performance on standardized tests increased by 4 percentile points the first year students attended small classes. And the test score advantage of students in small classes expanded by about 1 percentile point per year in subsequent years. So one of the last questions we'll ask is, do school finance reforms matter? And the answer is yes, they can have big effects on student outcomes, including reductions in both the levels and disparities in these outcomes. Not only does money matter, but reforms that take into account how that money is distributed matter too. So, for example, providing smaller classes, providing higher teacher salaries to attract better teachers. But we are still unsure which interventions or reforms provide the most bang for the buck. In conclusion, the way our educational system in the U.S. operates allows for inconsistencies across states. So some students get more money, other students get less money. These inconsistencies have made it difficult to research what matters and what doesn't matter. We think that school funding matters, specifically in terms of allowing for smaller classrooms, adequate facilities and resources, and more qualified teachers. We think it matters more to at-risk populations, so for example, to students who live in poorer areas. But we are still unsure about what other types of school reform matters or will provide the greatest gains in student achievement. I hope you've enjoyed this lecture.